April 1945. The world is on fire. Nazi Germany is collapsing and the roads of Europe are choked with chaos, fear, and the desperate final acts of a dying regime. But on a forgotten dirt road near Celle, Germany, a single moment unfolds that almost no one in America has ever heard about, a moment that would test the limits of courage, humanity, and the power of words over violence. Picture this: a lone Canadian officer stands in the middle of a muddy road, his uniform caked with dust, his hands empty. He's not holding a rifle, he's not shouting orders. He's just standing there, blocking the path of 15 armed SS guards, men infamous for their brutality, their loyalty to Hitler, and their willingness to kill without hesitation. Behind this officer, huddled together in the cold spring air, are 162 women. They're barely alive, their bodies reduced to skin and bone, their faces hollowed by months of starvation and terror. They wear the striped uniforms of concentration camp prisoners, and every one of them knows that the next few seconds could mean life or death. The SS guards grip their machine guns, fingers twitching on the triggers. Their orders are clear: if the Allies get too close, kill every prisoner, no witnesses, no survivors. The women behind the officer are so weak they can barely stand. Some lean on each other, others collapse to the ground, too exhausted to move. The stench of death and disease hangs in the air, mixing with the scent of spring flowers, a cruel reminder that nature keeps going, even as human cruelty reaches its peak. This isn't a scene from a Hollywood movie. This isn't a story you'll find in most American history books, but it's real. It happened. And in this moment, the fate of 162 innocent lives hangs on a single man's decision. He has tanks and soldiers behind him, but he knows that if a firefight breaks out, the prisoners will be the first to die. The SS are desperate, cornered, and ready to do the unthinkable. So what does he do? He steps forward alone, unarmed, and starts to talk. Not with threats, not with violence, but with a calm, steady voice that cuts through the tension like a knife. He gambles everything on the hope that words, just words, can stop bullets. That reason can overpower fanaticism, that even in the darkest hour there's a chance for mercy. This is the story of Major Ben Cochburn, the Canadian officer who faced down death itself and saved 162 women from a massacre without firing a single shot. It's a story almost lost to history, overshadowed by the thunder of tanks and the headlines of victory. But what happened on that road near Celle is a reminder that sometimes, the most powerful weapon isn't a gun or a bomb, it's the courage to stand alone and speak when it matters most. If you think you know everything about World War II, think again. Because what happened next would shock even the most hardened American soldier and change the lives of hundreds of families forever. But to understand how one man's words could rewrite fate, you have to see what he was up against. And that's where this story truly begins. Before you can understand the gravity of what happened on that German road, you have to look into the eyes of the women who stood behind Major Ben Cochburn. These weren't just numbers. They weren't faceless victims. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, each with a story, each with a life that had been ripped apart by the machinery of the Holocaust. And on that day in April 1945, every single one of them was standing on the razor's edge between life and death. Imagine the scene: 162 women, barely recognizable as human, huddled together in the chill of a German spring. Their bodies are so emaciated that their arms look like broomsticks, their legs like twigs. Their faces are hollow, eyes sunken deep into their skulls, cheeks drawn tight over bone. Most of them weigh less than 80 pounds, less than the average American middle schooler. Their striped prison uniforms hang off their bodies like rags, stained with mud, blood, and the filth of months spent in captivity. These women are survivors of Bergen-Belsen, one of the most notorious Nazi concentration camps. If you've ever seen the black and white photos of liberation, those haunting images of skeletal figures behind barbed wire, these are the women who lived that nightmare. But their ordeal didn't end when the Allies approached. As the Nazi regime crumbled, the SS forced thousands of prisoners on what became known as death marches, brutal forced marches across the German countryside, designed to hide evidence of the camps and ensure that no witnesses survived to tell the world what really happened. For these 162 women, the march was a living hell. They were given almost no food, barely any water. Anyone who stumbled or fell behind was shot on the spot, their bodies left in ditches as a warning to the others. The guards didn't care about names or stories. To them, these women were just numbers, numbers to be erased before the Allies could find them. But these women were more than numbers. They were Jewish, Polish, Hungarian, Dutch targets of Nazi hatred, condemned for nothing more than their heritage or beliefs. Some had been teachers, nurses, artists, or students before the war. Some had families waiting for them, not knowing if they were alive or dead. Others had already lost everything, clinging to life with nothing but sheer willpower. The conditions they endured are almost impossible for most Americans to imagine. They slept in ditches, drank from puddles, and watched friends collapse and die beside them. Disease was everywhere: typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. Lice crawled through their hair and clothing, open sores festered on their skin. The stench of death was so thick it clung to their bodies, their hair, their breath. For months, hope had been a luxury they couldn't afford. They walked because stopping meant a bullet. They breathed because their bodies hadn't figured out how to quit. And yet, even in this nightmare, there were moments of stubborn humanity. Some women shared scraps of bread, whispered prayers, or held each other up when their legs gave out. They clung to memories of home, of family, of a world that had once made sense. For many, the only thing keeping them moving was the faint, desperate hope that someone, anyone, might find them before it was too late. But as the days dragged on, that hope faded. They had seen what happened to those who tried to escape. They had watched guards shoot women for the crime of being too weak to walk. They had learned not to trust the promise of rescue because rescue had always come too late. So when Major Cochburn and his Canadian tanks appeared on that road, the women didn't cheer. They didn't cry out for help. They barely reacted at all. They had seen liberators before, soldiers who tried to intervene only to be gunned down by the SS. They had learned that hope was dangerous, that hope could get you killed. But behind their hollow eyes, behind the layers of trauma and exhaustion, there was still a spark, a stubborn refusal to give up, even when the world had given up on them. That spark is what made them survivors. That spark is what made them worth saving. And in that moment, as the SS guards prepared to finish what the camps had started, the fate of these 162 women rested on a single, unimaginable gamble. That one man's words could be enough to save them. But before we get to that confrontation, you need to understand just how desperate, how hopeless, and how utterly alone these women truly were. Because only then can you grasp the full weight of what happened next, and why it matters not just for them, but for all of us. To truly understand the stakes on that German road, you have to step back and see the world as it was in April 1945. The Second World War was in its final, most desperate days. Nazi Germany, once the most feared military machine on earth, was crumbling from every direction. American GIs were storming across the Rhine, liberating cities and towns that had been under the Nazi boot for years. The Soviet Red Army was smashing through the east, leaving a trail of destruction as it closed in on Berlin. The British and Canadians were pushing from the north and west, determined to end the nightmare once and for all. But the end of the war didn't mean peace. It meant chaos, chaos on a scale that's hard for most Americans to imagine. The German countryside was a patchwork of shattered towns, burned-out vehicles, and desperate refugees. Millions of people were on the move. German civilians fleeing the Red Army, Allied prisoners of war stumbling toward freedom, and hidden among them the survivors of the Nazi concentration camps, ghosts in striped uniforms, barely alive, clinging to the hope that someone would find them before the SS did. For the Nazis, these final weeks were a time of panic and paranoia. Hitler's so-called Thousand-Year Reich was collapsing in a matter of days. The Nazi leadership knew the Allies were closing in and they were desperate to cover up the evidence of their crimes. Orders went out from the highest levels: evacuate the camps, destroy the records, and most chilling of all, leave no witnesses. If the Allies got too close, the guards were to kill every last prisoner. No exceptions, no mercy. This was the world Major Ben Cochburn and his men entered as they rolled through Lower Saxony. For weeks, their advance had been almost routine. German soldiers surrendered in droves, waving white flags, eager to escape the wrath of the Soviets or simply too exhausted to fight. Town after town fell with barely a shot fired. For many American and Canadian soldiers, it felt like the war was winding down, like the worst was finally over. But the reality was far more complicated and far more dangerous. The Nazi regime was dying, but it was still deadly. Fanatical SS units roamed the countryside, carrying out last-ditch orders with terrifying efficiency. Death marches crisscrossed the landscape, leaving trails of bodies in their wake. The air was thick with rumors, stories of camps where people were worked to death, of mass graves, of atrocities so monstrous that even battle-hardened American soldiers struggled to believe them. Most Allied troops had heard whispers about concentration camps, but few understood the true scale of the horror. Intelligence reports mentioned prison camps and harsh conditions, but the full truth, the industrialized murder, the gas chambers, the systematic extermination, was still hidden behind a wall of Nazi lies and disbelief. Even the most seasoned officers couldn't imagine the reality that awaited them. And so, when Cochburn's unit rounded that bend and saw the column of women guarded by SS troops, it was like stepping into a nightmare. This wasn't the war they'd trained for. This wasn't a battle between soldiers. This was something darker, something that would haunt everyone who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. The SS guards were the embodiment of Nazi fanaticism. Well-fed, well-armed, and utterly ruthless, they had spent years running death camps and carrying out orders that turned ordinary men into monsters. Some believed in the Nazi cause with a terrifying zeal. Others followed orders out of fear, knowing that disobedience meant death. But in those final days, even the most loyal SS men could see the writing on the wall. The Reich was finished. The only question was how many more would die before it finally fell. For the women in the column, the chaos of the war's end offered no safety. If anything, it made their situation even more dangerous. The guards were desperate, cornered, and determined to erase every trace of their crimes. The women had survived the camps, survived the death march, only to find themselves facing execution on a lonely road with no one left to help them. And yet, in the middle of this chaos, a single moment of humanity was about to change everything. Major Cochburn, faced with an impossible choice, would have to decide whether to risk everything on a gamble that seemed almost insane, that even in the heart of darkness, words could be more powerful than bullets. This was the world of April 1945, a world where every decision could mean the difference between life and death, where the line between good and evil was drawn in blood, and where the actions of a single person could echo across generations. For the American soldiers fighting their way across Europe, for the families waiting anxiously back home, and for the millions whose lives hung in the balance, the end of the war was not just a victory, it was a reckoning. And on that road near Celle, the reckoning was about to begin. But before the first word was spoken, before the first life was saved, the fate of 162 women and the legacy of an entire generation hung by a thread. What happened next would test the limits of courage, compassion, and the very meaning of victory itself. To truly grasp the gravity of what happened on that German road, you need to know the man who stood at the center of it all. Major Ben Cochburn wasn't a household name in America, or even in his native Canada. But in April 1945, he became the kind of leader whose actions would ripple across continents and generations. His story is one that resonates with anyone who believes in courage, quick thinking, and the power of doing the right thing, even when the world is falling apart. Born in Toronto in 1915, Ben Cochburn grew up in a world that was still reeling from the aftermath of World War I like so many young men of his generation. He was shaped by stories of sacrifice and heroism, but also by the hope that such horrors would never return. He went to ordinary schools, played baseball in city parks, and dreamed of a future that didn't involve war. But when Hitler's armies marched across Europe and the world was plunged into chaos once again, Cochburn didn't hesitate. He joined the Canadian Army in 1940, trading a quiet life for the uncertainty and danger of the battlefield. By the time he found himself on that fateful road in Germany, Cochburn was no stranger to combat. He fought through the mud and blood of the Italian campaign, where every inch of ground was paid for in lives. He led his men through the shattered towns of northwest Europe, pushing back against the Nazi war machine yard by yard. He'd seen friends fall, witnessed the devastation of cities, and learned firsthand that war was never as simple as good versus evil. It was chaos, confusion, and split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. But what set Cochburn apart wasn't just his experience, it was his reputation. Among his men, he was known for two things: keeping his cool under fire and finding solutions where others saw only dead ends. He wasn't the kind of officer who barked orders from behind the lines. He rode in tanks with his soldiers, shared their rations, and faced the same dangers they did. When the bullets started flying, Cochburn was right there in the thick of it, leading by example. His men trusted him not just because he was brave, but because he was smart, always thinking, always adapting, always looking for a way to save lives instead of wasting them. In the US military, there's a saying, lead from the front. It's about more than just bravery, it's about responsibility. It's about being the first to face danger and the last to leave a man behind. That's exactly how Cochburn operated. He never asked his soldiers to do anything he wouldn't do himself. And when things went wrong, as they so often did in the chaos of war, he didn't panic. He assessed, he adapted, and he acted. That mindset would prove crucial on the day he encountered the SS guards and their prisoners. Nothing in his training had prepared him for what he saw: women reduced to skeletons, guarded by men who had spent years turning murder into routine. The contrast was staggering. On one side, well-fed SS officers in crisp uniforms, armed to the teeth. On the other, women so weak they could barely stand, their eyes hollow from months of starvation and terror. For most officers, the situation would have seemed impossible. Any attempt to use force would almost certainly result in a massacre. The SS had their guns trained on the prisoners, ready to kill at the first sign of trouble. But Cochburn's instincts kicked in. He understood that this wasn't just a military problem, it was a moral one. Every second of hesitation meant another life lost to starvation or disease. But rushing in with guns blazing would only guarantee disaster. So Cochburn did something that defied every expectation. He left his rifle behind, stepped out from behind the safety of his tanks, and walked straight toward the enemy alone, unarmed and exposed. It was a move that took nerves of steel, the kind of courage that goes beyond the battlefield. He was betting his life and the lives of his men on the hope that reason could win out over fanaticism. What made him take that risk? Maybe it was his years of experience, his understanding of human nature, or the simple fact that he refused to let evil have the last word. Maybe it was the knowledge that, in that moment, he was the only thing standing between 162 women and certain death. Whatever the reason, Cochburn's decision would become a defining moment, not just for him, but for everyone who witnessed it. In America, we celebrate leaders who rise to the occasion, who make the hard choices when it matters most. Major Ben Cochburn was that kind of leader. He didn't have the luxury of time or the certainty of success. All he had was his judgment, his courage, and his belief that even in the darkest hour, one person's actions could make a difference. As he faced down the SS captain, Cochburn wasn't just representing Canada, he was standing for every Allied soldier who fought to end the nightmare of Nazi tyranny. He was proof that leadership isn't about rank or medals. It's about stepping up when the world needs you most and refusing to back down in the face of evil. And as the tension on that road reached its breaking point, Cochburn's next move would determine the fate of 162 lives, and echo through history as a testament to the power of courage, compassion, and the unbreakable human spirit. What happened next would test every lesson he'd ever learned, and show the world that sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is simply stand your ground and speak. The world held its breath on that narrow German road. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. On one side, Major Ben Cochburn stood alone, his uniform marked by the maple leaf of Canada, but his courage echoing the spirit of every American and Allied soldier who ever faced impossible odds. On the other side, 15 SS guards, their faces hard and unreadable, their machine guns pointed at 162 women who had already survived the unimaginable. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes your heart pound and your hands sweat, even if you're just hearing the story decades later. This was not a battle of armies. It was a battle of nerves, of psychology, of willpower. The SS guards had been trained to obey without question, to kill without hesitation. Their orders were clear: if the Allies got too close, there would be no survivors. The women behind Cochburn were so weak they could barely stand, let alone run. Any sign of violence, any sudden move, and the massacre would begin. The Canadian tanks behind Cochburn had their guns trained on the SS, but everyone knew that if bullets started flying, the prisoners would be the first to fall. Cochburn understood this perfectly. He knew that firepower alone couldn't save these women. He needed something more powerful than guns, he needed words. So with every eye on him, he stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the SS captain. He left the safety of his tanks, left his rifle behind, and walked into the danger zone, unarmed except for the sidearm at his hip. Every step was a gamble, a test of nerve. His own men watched in stunned silence, ready to open fire if things went wrong, but knowing that their commander was betting everything on a different kind of courage. When Cochburn reached the SS captain, he spoke in fluent German, a skill he'd honed during years of interrogating prisoners and reading enemy reports. His voice was calm, almost casual, but every word was chosen with care. He didn't threaten. He didn't beg. He simply laid out the facts, as cold and undeniable as the steel of a tank barrel. "The war is over," he said. "You know it, I know it, everyone here knows it. You can fight and you'll die. We have tanks, we have air support. You'll be wiped out, and when we report what happened here, no mercy will be shown to any SS unit we encounter. Or you can hand over the prisoners, walk away, and maybe live to see another day. The choice is yours." It was a masterstroke of negotiation, an appeal not to morality but to self-preservation. Cochburn didn't ask the SS captain to surrender. He offered him a way out, a chance to survive when the rest of the world was collapsing. He gave the captain a face-saving option, a way to obey orders without dying for a lost cause. And all the while, the threat of overwhelming force hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. The SS captain didn't answer right away. He stood there, his hand on his pistol, his eyes flicking from Cochburn to the tanks, to his own men, to the women behind him. You could almost see the calculations running through his mind, the years of Nazi indoctrination battling against the raw instinct to survive. Did he really want to die for a regime that was already in its death throes? Did he want to be remembered as a murderer, or as a man who chose mercy at the last possible moment? The silence stretched on, every second feeling like an eternity. The women behind Cochburn barely dared to breathe. His own soldiers gripped their weapons, waiting for the slightest sign that things were about to go wrong. Even the birds in the trees seemed to fall silent, as if the whole world was watching this showdown. Finally, the SS captain made his choice. He nodded just once, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Then he turned to his men and gave the order: "Lower your weapons, line up the prisoners for transfer, we're leaving." The guards hesitated, uncertain, but the captain repeated the order, louder this time. One by one the rifles dropped, the machine guns pointed at the ground. The women were gathered into a rough line, though most could barely stand. And then, without another word, the SS guards turned and marched away, disappearing into the chaos of a dying empire. Cochburn didn't arrest them. He didn't order his men to shoot them in the back. He let them go, a decision that would spark controversy later, but in that moment it was the only choice that saved lives. Not a single shot was fired, not one bullet wasted, just words, timing, and the kind of nerve that most people only dream about. For the women, the realization came slowly, almost too late to matter. They had been seconds from death, and now suddenly they were free. Some collapsed to the ground, sobbing with relief. Others stared in disbelief, unable to process what had just happened. Cochburn's medics rushed forward, their training kicking in as they began the grim work of saving as many lives as possible. This was the moment when words proved stronger than weapons. It was a victory not just for Cochburn, not just for Canada, but for every American and Allied soldier who ever believed that courage and compassion could change the course of history. The standoff on that German road was over, but the story was just beginning, because what happened next would reveal the true cost of survival and the lasting impact of one man's decision to bet everything on the power of words. The moment the SS guards disappeared into the German countryside, the world seemed to shift. For the first time in months, maybe years, the 162 women who had survived the death march were no longer prisoners. But freedom, when it finally arrived, didn't come with cheers or celebration. It came with silence, shock, and a tidal wave of emotion that no one on that road would ever forget. At first, nobody moved. The women stood frozen, too weak to process what had just happened. Some stared at the empty road where their captors had vanished, as if expecting the nightmare to return at any second. Others simply collapsed, their bodies finally giving out now that the threat of instant death had passed. For many, the realization that they were still alive was almost too much to bear. Cochburn's soldiers, hardened by years of combat, found themselves facing a new kind of battle, one they'd never trained for. These were men who had stormed enemy positions, survived artillery barrages, and watched friends fall in the mud of Europe. But nothing had prepared them for the sight of these women. Skin and bone, eyes hollow with suffering, some so malnourished they could barely lift their heads. The smell of death and disease was everywhere, a grim reminder of the horrors they had endured. The medics rushed in, their medical bags slung over their shoulders, faces pale with shock. Captain Morris, the unit's medical officer, took one look at the survivors and knew the situation was dire. He'd seen terrible wounds on the battlefield, shrapnel, gunshots, burns, but this was different. This was the aftermath of systematic starvation, disease, and neglect on a scale that defied belief. He quickly began triage, moving from woman to woman, checking vital signs, searching for the most critical cases. 7 women were already beyond saving. Their bodies had been pushed past the point where even the best medical care couldn't bring them back. They died within hours, but not alone. Cochburn's medics held their hands, whispered words of comfort, and made sure their last moments were filled with kindness instead of cruelty. For the rest, the fight for survival was just beginning. 23 women needed immediate hospitalization for typhus, a deadly disease spread by lice that had ravaged the camps. All 162 suffered from severe malnutrition. Most had tuberculosis, dysentery, and infected wounds that had never been treated. The average weight was less than 80 pounds, less than half what a healthy adult woman should weigh. The soldiers did what they could. Some offered their rations, desperate to help, but Captain Morris quickly stopped them. "Too much food too fast will kill them," he warned. "We have to go slow or we'll lose them to refeeding syndrome." It was a cruel irony after months of starvation. Even kindness could be deadly if not handled with care. The emotional toll was just as severe. Some of the women wept openly, clutching at the hands of their rescuers, whispering thanks in Polish, Hungarian, Dutch, Yiddish, and German. Others were too traumatized to speak, their voices stolen by months of terror. A Dutch woman named Rachel Kleinman stared at the maple leaf on Cochburn's uniform, not knowing what country it represented, only that the man wearing it had somehow made the SS leave. Years later, she would write, "We saw the maple leaf and did not know what country it represented. We knew only that the man with the strange accent had talked and the SS had left, and we were somehow impossibly still alive." For the Canadian and American soldiers, the scene was overwhelming. Some wept openly, unable to hold back tears. Others turned away, sickened by the sight and smell of so much suffering. Sergeant William Morrison, a tank commander, sat on the ground and wrote in his diary with shaking hands, "We have seen terrible things in this war. Burned cities, dead soldiers, civilians caught in crossfire. But this is different. This is evil made flesh. This is what we've been fighting against, even when we didn't fully understand it. Now we understand, now we know." The medical crisis was urgent. Captain Morris and his team worked through the night, doing everything they could to stabilize the survivors. They cleaned wounds, administered antibiotics, and tried to bring down fevers. They documented everything, names, conditions, testimonies, knowing that these women were living evidence of crimes the world was only beginning to comprehend. But even as they worked, the reality set in. Not everyone would make it. Some women died in the days that followed, their bodies simply too broken to recover. But for the rest, the nightmare was finally over. They had survived the camps, survived the death march, and now, against all odds, they had survived the standoff on that German road. For the soldiers, the experience left scars that would last a lifetime. Many would struggle with nightmares haunted by the memory of what they had seen. But they also carried something else, a sense of purpose, a reminder of why they had fought, and a belief that even in the darkest moments, compassion and courage could make a difference. The immediate aftermath of the rescue was a mix of relief and grief, hope and heartbreak. But it was also the beginning of something bigger, a story that would ripple out across the world, changing lives, shaping history, and reminding us all that even in the face of unimaginable evil, humanity can prevail. And as the sun rose over that battered road in Germany, the survivors and their rescuers faced a new day, one filled with pain but also with the promise of life. The world would soon learn what had happened there, and the impact would be felt far beyond the battlefield, reaching all the way to the homes and hearts of families across America. Because what happened next would not only change the fate of 162 women, it would change the way the world understood the true cost and the true meaning of freedom. The rescue of 162 women on a lonely German road didn't just save lives. It sent shockwaves through the Allied ranks and changed the way the world would remember the final days of World War II. For many American viewers, it's easy to think of the war's end as a time of clear-cut victories and celebrations. But the truth is, the aftermath of Major Ben Cochburn's gamble was anything but simple. It was a moment that forced soldiers, commanders, and even entire nations to confront the true cost of survival and the moral gray zones that come with it. Word of the rescue spread quickly through the Canadian and American lines. At first, it was just a story passed from one unit to another. A Canadian officer had faced down the SS and saved a column of women without firing a shot. But as the details emerged, the story took on a life of its own. The testimonies of the survivors, collected by Cochburn and his medics, were rushed to Allied intelligence. These weren't just rumors or second-hand reports. These were living, breathing witnesses, each with a number tattooed on her arm and a story that confirmed the worst fears of Allied commanders. For months, American and British intelligence officers had been receiving reports about the Nazi death camps. Some of these reports were so horrific that they were dismissed as enemy propaganda. After all, who could believe that an entire government would build factories of death, designed to erase millions of people from the face of the earth? But now, the evidence was undeniable. The women rescued by Cochburn's unit became living proof of the Holocaust, proof that would soon be used in war crimes trials and history books around the world. The impact on Allied tactics was immediate. Commanders realized that the Nazi policy of no witnesses meant that every death march, every column of prisoners was a potential massacre waiting to happen. Orders went out to all units: watch for prisoner columns, intervene if possible, and use negotiation before force. Cochburn's approach, offering the enemy a choice, appealing to their self-preservation, became a model for other officers. Over the final weeks of the war, Canadian and American units liberated hundreds more prisoners using similar tactics. In some cases, entire SS units surrendered rather than risk a firefight with Allied tanks. But the rescue also sparked controversy, especially among the military police and war crimes investigators. Many officers were furious that the SS guards had been allowed to walk away. How can you let murderers escape? They demanded. How can you allow men who ran death marches to just disappear into Germany? For some, the answer was simple. Every second spent chasing the SS was another second that women died from starvation or disease. For others, it was a bitter pill to swallow. Justice, they argued, demanded accountability. This debate would echo for years, especially as the world learned more about the scale of Nazi atrocities. Some of the SS guards who walked away that day were later tracked down and put on trial. Others vanished into the chaos of post-war Europe, their fates unknown. But the survivors never forgot the choice that had been made. For them, the fact that they were alive was all that mattered. As one woman later wrote, "I would rather see my rescuer let a murderer go than see my friends die in a ditch." The ripple effects didn't stop at the front lines. When news of the rescue reached the United States, it became part of a larger reckoning with the reality of the Holocaust. American newspapers published photographs of the survivors, their gaunt faces starring out from the pages in stark black and white. The stories of Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, and other camps became impossible to ignore. For many Americans, these images were a wake-up call, a reminder that the war had been about more than just defeating an enemy. It had been about stopping an evil that threatened the very foundations of civilization. The survivors' testimonies played a crucial role in the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi leaders were prosecuted for crimes against humanity. Their stories, painstakingly documented by Cochburn and his team, became evidence that no one could deny. The world was forced to confront the reality of genocide, and the phrase "never again" took on a new, urgent meaning. But the impact of the rescue went even further. In the years that followed, the story of Major Ben Cochburn and the women he saved became a symbol of what the Allies had fought for. It was taught in schools, discussed in military academies, and remembered at Holocaust memorials across North America. For American families who had lost loved ones in the war, it was a reminder that their sacrifice had helped bring an end to one of history's greatest evils. Yet the controversy lingered. Some argued that letting the SS guards go was a mistake, a failure of justice. Others insisted that saving lives was the only thing that mattered. In the end, the rescue forced everyone, soldiers, survivors, and civilians alike, to grapple with the hard truths of war, that sometimes the right choice isn't the easy one, and that mercy can be as powerful as justice. The ripples from that day in April 1945 are still felt today. The survivors and their descendants have built new lives in America, Canada, and around the world. Their stories continue to inspire, to educate, and to remind us all that even in the darkest moments, one person's courage can change the course of history. And as the world continues to face new challenges, the lesson of that German road remains as relevant as ever. That the choices we make about justice, mercy, and the value of every human life can echo across generations, shaping the future in ways we can't even imagine. The story of Major Ben Cochburn and the 162 women he saved is more than just a chapter in a history book. It's a call to remember, to act, and to believe that even in the face of evil, hope can prevail. History is often told in numbers: battalions, casualties, miles advanced, or prisoners liberated. But the true impact of Major Ben Cochburn's rescue isn't measured in statistics. It's found in the lives of the women who survived that day, in the families they built, and in the echoes of their stories that reached all the way to the United States and beyond. Take Rachel Kleinman, for example. When Canadian medics found her on that German road, she weighed just 68 pounds. Typhus had ravaged her body, and the doctors gave her a slim chance of surviving the week. But Rachel was stubborn. She clung to life with the same determination that had carried her through Bergen-Belsen and the Death March. Against all odds, she survived. In 1947, she immigrated to Canada, settling in Toronto, but her story didn't end there. She learned English, found work, and eventually became a Holocaust educator, traveling to schools across North America, including the United States, to share her testimony. Her message was simple but powerful. We saw the maple leaf and did not know what country it represented. We knew only that the man with the strange accent had talked and the SS had left, and we were somehow impossibly still alive. Rachel's story became a bridge between continents, a living reminder to American students that the fight against hatred and indifference is never over. Then there's Anna Kowalski, just 19 years old when she was rescued. She was so weak that medics had to carry her to a field hospital. The odds were against her: advanced tuberculosis, severe malnutrition, and infections that would have killed most. But Anna refused to die. She survived, immigrated to Montreal, and married a Canadian veteran. Together, they raised 4 children. At the 50th anniversary of the rescue, Anna spoke through tears. "I was dead, we all were. We were walking corpses, waiting for the bullet that would finish us. Then a man I never saw before decided I deserved to live. How do you thank someone for your existence? You can't. You just live the best life you can and hope that's enough." Anna's children and grandchildren would go on to visit the United States, sharing her story at museums and remembrance events, connecting her survival to a new generation of Americans. But not every story ended in triumph. One Polish woman whose name is lost to history was given a piece of chocolate by a young Canadian private named James Chen. She ate a small piece, then carefully wrapped the rest, hoping to share it with her sister when they were reunited. She didn't know her sister had already perished in the gas chambers months before. The chocolate wrapper became a keepsake, pressed between the pages of a photo album, a symbol of hope and loss. Years later, her daughter would donate that wrapper to the Canadian War Museum, where it sits today, a silent testament to the dreams that survived even the darkest times. American visitors to the museum often pause at this display, struck by the power of a simple piece of foil to tell a story of both heartbreak and resilience. The rescuers, too, carried the weight of what they had seen. Private James Chen returned to Canada haunted by nightmares, what we now call PTSD. Loud noises sent him diving for cover, and crowds made him anxious. But he stayed in touch with several survivors, helping them navigate immigration paperwork and writing letters of support. In a letter written in 1975, he tried to explain why. "I saw the worst of humanity and the best. The worst was what they endured in the camps. The best was that they survived and rebuilt lives. That's the only thing that lets me sleep at night, knowing that something good came from all that horror." Chen's words resonate with American veterans who have faced their own battles with trauma, reminding us that healing is possible, even after the unthinkable. Major Ben Cochburn himself returned to Toronto after the war, trading his uniform for a teacher's chalk. For 37 years, he taught high school history, never mentioning his own role in the rescue. His students had no idea that their mild-mannered teacher had once stood face-to-face with SS guards and talked his way through a potential massacre. Only at his funeral did some of them learn the truth. For Americans who value humility and quiet heroism, Cochburn's story is a powerful reminder that true greatness often hides in plain sight. The legacy of the rescue didn't stop with the survivors. Many of the women immigrated to North America, including the United States, where they built new lives, started families, and contributed to their communities. Their children and grandchildren became doctors, teachers, artists, and even soldiers, some joining the U.S. military, inspired by the story of the Canadian officer who saved their family. At reunions and Holocaust remembrance events across the U.S., descendants of the 162 women gather to share their stories, determined to keep the memory alive. For American viewers, these personal stories are more than just history, they're a call to action. They remind us that the fight against hatred, indifference, and injustice is ongoing. They show us that one act of courage can ripple across generations, changing lives in ways we can't even imagine. And they prove that even in the darkest moments, hope can survive and new beginnings are always possible. As the survivors and their families built new lives in North America, their stories became woven into the fabric of American society. They taught us that freedom isn't just something you win on the battlefield. It's something you fight for every day in every act of kindness, every stand against injustice, and every choice to remember rather than forget. The story of Major Ben Cochburn and the women he saved is a testament to the power of survival, the cost of trauma, and the promise of new beginnings. A story that belongs not just to Canada but to America and to the world. The story of Major Ben Cochburn and the 162 women he saved didn't end on that German road. In fact, that moment was just the beginning of a legacy that would ripple across decades, continents, and generations, including right here in the United States. For Americans, the lessons of this rescue are more than just a footnote in history. They're a living reminder of what's possible when courage, compassion, and moral clarity come together at the right moment. After the war, the survivors of Cochburn's rescue scattered across the globe. Many found new homes in North America, with dozens immigrating to the United States. They arrived with little more than the clothes on their backs and the scars of their ordeal, but they brought with them something even more powerful: the determination to rebuild, to remember, and to make sure that the horrors they survived would never be repeated. In cities like New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Miami, these women and their families became part of the American story, raising children, starting businesses, and contributing to the communities that welcomed them. Their impact was felt in ways both big and small. Some became teachers, sharing their stories in classrooms from Boston to San Francisco, helping American students understand the true cost of hatred and the value of standing up for what's right. Others became doctors, nurses, and social workers, dedicating their lives to healing and helping others. Their children and grandchildren grew up with a deep sense of gratitude for the second chance they'd been given, and a commitment to honoring the memory of those who didn't survive. The legacy of the rescue also shaped American policy and public opinion. In the years after World War II, the United States faced tough questions about its own response to the Holocaust and its willingness to accept refugees. The stories of survivors like those saved by Cochburn helped shift the national conversation, fueling support for more open immigration policies and greater humanitarian aid. When Americans saw the faces of the rescued women in newspapers and on television, it became impossible to ignore the moral responsibility to help those fleeing persecution and violence. But the legacy wasn't just about policy, it was about identity. The rescue became a symbol of what the Allied victory truly meant. It wasn't just about defeating an enemy on the battlefield. It was about saving lives, restoring hope, and proving that even in the darkest times, humanity could prevail. For American veterans who fought in Europe, the story of the 162 women was a powerful reminder of why their sacrifice mattered. For their families, it was a source of pride and inspiration, a testament to the idea that one person's courage can change the world. The lessons of the rescue have been passed down through generations. Today, the descendants of those 162 women number in the hundreds, many of them living in the United States. They gather for reunions, share their family histories at Holocaust museums, and speak at schools and universities. Their stories are woven into the fabric of American life, a living legacy that challenges each new generation to remember, to act, and to believe in the power of hope. The rescue also left its mark on the American military. Cochburn's approach, using negotiation, psychology, and moral authority instead of brute force, became a case study in leadership courses and military academies. U.S. officers learned that sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is put down your weapon and trust in the power of words. The story of the standoff near Celle became a lesson in restraint, empathy, and the importance of preserving life whenever possible. Memorials and museums across the United States honor the memory of the Holocaust and those who survived it. In places like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., visitors can see artifacts, photographs, and testimonies from survivors, including some of the women rescued by Cochburn. Their stories are a powerful reminder that history is not just about dates and battles, but about real people, real choices, and real consequences. For American viewers, the legacy of Major Ben Cochburn's rescue is a call to action. It challenges us to look beyond the headlines, to see the humanity in every refugee, every survivor, every person fighting for a second chance. It reminds us that the fight against hatred and indifference is never over, and that the choices we make today will shape the world our children inherit. As we reflect on the story of the 162 women and the man who saved them, we're reminded that the true measure of victory isn't found in conquered territory or defeated enemies. It's found in the lives saved, the hope restored, and the generations that follow. The legacy of that day in April 1945 lives on in every American who believes in justice, compassion, and the power of one person to make a difference. And as long as their stories are told, as long as their names are remembered, the lesson endures. Even in the darkest hour, courage and kindness can change the course of history, not just for one group or one nation, but for the entire world. As the dust settled on that forgotten German road in April 1945, the world was forever changed, not by a grand military victory, but by a single, extraordinary act of courage. Major Ben Cochburn's decision to face down the SS with nothing but his words and his willpower didn't just save 162 women from certain death. It proved in the most dramatic way possible that the choices we make, even in the darkest moments, can echo across generations and continents, shaping the future in ways we can barely imagine. For American viewers, this story is more than just a piece of distant history. It's a living testament to the values that define us as a nation: courage in the face of evil, compassion for the vulnerable, and the belief that one person's actions can make a difference. In a world that often feels divided and uncertain, the legacy of that day near Celle, Germany, reminds us that hope is never truly lost, not as long as there are people willing to stand up, speak out, and do what's right. Think about the ripple effect of that one choice. The 162 women who survived went on to rebuild their lives, many of them in North America. They became mothers, grandmothers, teachers, artists, and community leaders. Their children and grandchildren, many of whom now call the United States home, carry with them the story of survival, resilience, and the power of a second chance. Every family gathering, every graduation, every new life born is a living rebuke to the forces of hatred and destruction that tried to erase them. But the impact didn't stop with the survivors. The story of Major Cochburn's rescue became a beacon for soldiers, diplomats, and ordinary citizens alike. In American military academies, his example is studied as a lesson in leadership and moral courage. In classrooms from New York to Los Angeles, students learn that history isn't just about battles and treaties. It's about the moments when ordinary people make extraordinary choices. And in communities across the country, the descendants of those rescued women continue to share their stories, ensuring that the memory of what happened on that road will never fade. There's a reason why this story resonates so deeply with Americans. It's because it speaks to something fundamental in our national character: the idea that we are all responsible for one another, that we are strongest when we stand together, and that even in the face of overwhelming odds, we never give up on hope. It's the same spirit that drove American GIs to storm the beaches of Normandy, that inspired civil rights leaders to march for justice, and that motivates everyday people to lend a hand to those in need. The lesson of Major Ben Cochburn and the 162 women he saved is clear. Heroism isn't always about grand gestures or dramatic battles. Sometimes it's about having the courage to do the right thing when no one else will. It's about believing that words can be more powerful than weapons, that mercy can triumph over vengeance, and that every life saved is a victory worth celebrating. As we look back on this story from the vantage point of the 21st century, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the challenges we face: division, conflict, and uncertainty. But the legacy of that day in 1945 offers a powerful reminder. The future is shaped by the choices we make today. Every act of kindness, every stand for justice, every refusal to turn away from suffering adds up, creating a world where hope can survive even in the darkest times. So the next time you wonder if one person can really make a difference, remember Major Ben Cochburn. Remember the 162 women who walked away from death and built new lives. Remember the families, the communities, and the generations that exist because of a single moment of courage. Their story is a challenge to all of us to speak up, to act with compassion, and to believe that even the smallest choice can change the course of history. In the end, the most powerful weapon isn't always the one you fire. Sometimes it's the one you never have to use at all. And sometimes the greatest victory is simply choosing to save a life when the world expects you to look away. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the power of your own choices, share it. Talk about it with your friends and family. Let it be a reminder that history is made not just by nations but by individuals, by people like you who refuse to let darkness have the last word. Because in America and everywhere, the power of one choice can change everything.